I was woken up at 2 in the morning. The knock at the door wasn't loud, but its persistence dragged me out of sleep instantly. It was Carlos, one of our workers. He stood at the doorway, his dusty jacket and tense face illuminated by the dim porch light. I didn't catch what he said right away, but the words, "Something strange," cut through my grogginess like an icy wind. Sliding out of bed, I fumbled for my boots. The bedroom floor was cold, and the darkness outside the window was so dense it felt like it could be sliced with a knife. I was still half asleep, but something in his tone forced me into action. Grabbing my jacket, I followed him. We crossed the yard, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet sounding like it was complaining about our late-night intrusion. Carlos led the way, his flashlight casting shaky, uneven beams as his hurried steps betrayed his unease. When we reached the pens, I felt it immediately. Something was off. The cows were huddled in the farthest corner, as if some unseen force had driven them there. Normally, they'd be resting peacefully, but now the entire herd was shifting and stomping nervously as if trying to hide. The beam from Carlos's flashlight skimmed over the wooden fence, and then I saw it. A carcass lay in the middle of the pen. For a second, I thought it was simply asleep, but as I stepped closer, the stench of blood hit me, a heavy metallic odor that clung to the air. Damn it, what could have done this? My heart sped up. These cows weren't just livestock, they were part of the family. Losing one felt like losing a close relative. I ran over and knelt by the carcass. Its neck was a bloody mess, torn open so savagely that muscle and sinew were visible. This wasn't just death, this was violence. Something had attacked it, and whatever it was, it didn't hold back. Carlos and Hector, another worker, stood nearby, whispering to each other. Their tense postures and constant glances at the surrounding darkness told me they were scared. Their fear fed mine. I needed answers. A cougar? A bear? Wolves? Those explanations made sense, but deep down, something about this felt wrong. I took the flashlight and began scanning the area. The beam danced across the ground, revealing hoofprints and splashes of blood. And then I saw them. Tracks. They were bizarre, large, deeply pressed into the dirt, but their shape was all wrong. They weren't wolf prints, and they weren't bear tracks either. They looked like something in between, a twisted mix of man and beast. Carlos and Hector noticed where my light was focused, and their whispers grew louder. It was clear they'd seen these tracks before, or at least something that reminded them of this. Their fear was contagious. The night silence wrapped around us, heavy and suffocating. The moon shone brightly, but its light felt more like the glint of a blade than anything comforting. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it a warning. My mind scrambled for logical explanations, but deep inside, unease swelled like a rising tide. Or maybe it was fear. I turned to Carlos and Hector, who stood a little ways off. Hector's face was pale, almost waxy, as though the blood had drained from it entirely. His trembling fingers gripped a rifle that seemed too heavy for him to hold steady. He tried to explain what had happened, but his voice kept breaking, as if he were afraid to say it out loud. Hector began his story. He'd been asleep in his room when a strange, heavy sensation in his gut woke him. It was an uneasiness he couldn't ignore, the kind that forces you outside into the night. Stepping out into the darkness, he was met with an eerie, charged silence that buzzed louder than any noise. Taking a few cautious steps from his house, he heard it, a scraping low and drawn out, like claws raking against wood. It wasn't the sound of animals, not hoofbeats or the soft grunts of the cows. This was different. Gathering his courage, he grabbed the flashlight and rifle from beside the door and ran toward the pens. his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. When he arrived, his flashlight caught a silhouette. It resembled a man, but not quite. The back was too hunched, the arms too long, and the legs ended in strange, angular paws. Hector was frozen in place, unable to look away. The thing stood there motionless, staring back at him as if studying him. Then, in a blur of motion, it darted away into the darkness, leaving behind only the smell of dampness and something animalistic. As Hector stammered out his account, he kept repeating one word like a mantra: Hombre Lobo. Werewolf. His voice shook and he looked like he might collapse. I pressed him for details, but his words were jumbled, as though he was too terrified to describe it fully, afraid that saying too much might summon it back. I decided we'd sort this out in the morning. For now, we needed to move the dead cow to prevent further trouble. With difficulty, we loaded the carcass onto a cart and started hauling it toward the disposal pit. The body was heavy and the stench of blood and decay grew stronger with every step, twisting my stomach into knots. As we passed the hay barn, a sudden chilling sound froze me in place. A skittering, like the patter of countless tiny feet, echoed from within. My flashlight beam swept across the barn's entrance, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A massive swarm of rats poured out, a dark, writhing flood surging northward as if fleeing something behind them. It was horrifying. The rats moved in a panicked tide, trampling over each other in their desperate flight. Carlos pressed himself against the wall, his face contorted in fear, while Hector muttered frantic prayers, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. When the swarm finally disappeared into the night, an oppressive silence settled around us. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep moving. We dragged the carcass to the pit and dumped it in. The splash echoed ominously, like even the water rejected the corpse. I told everyone to get some sleep. I woke up earlier than usual. My sleep had been restless, haunted by thoughts of the night before. Skipping breakfast, I poured myself a cup of coffee and headed straight for the pen. The air was cool and heavy, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, painting the barren plains in somber shades of gray and ochre. The pen looked like it still bore the scars of the night. The cows were huddled in the far corner, their wide eyes filled with a fear I'd never seen before. They weren't moving, as if some invisible force still held them captive. As I approached, I noticed tracks in the dirt. They started where the dead cow had been and led out of the pen. The prints were still fresh, damp in the morning light, and their shape. It was unsettling. These weren't cougar or bear tracks. They weren't even wolf prints. They looked wrong, a grotesque blend of animal claws and something disturbingly human. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures, planning to show them to someone in town. The tracks led toward the eastern edge of the ranch, disappearing into the rocky soil that stretched into the desert. I followed them as far as I could. The desert yawned before me, a vast ocean of sand and sparse shrubs, and the tracks vanished somewhere among the boulders. What kind of creature could this be? I thought, unable to shake the memory of Hector stammering about Hombre Lobo. No, that was ridiculous. It had to be a wild animal. Logic told me it might have been a bear or something similar, but the wounds on the cow's neck made me doubt. Those clean, deep cuts weren't made by ordinary teeth. I made up my mind. We'd set up a night watch. Maybe even invest in cameras or some kind of security system. This land was all I had left of my father, who'd passed away last year. The ranch was my connection to him, my inheritance. My mother had died when I was born, so I was alone here, really. The workers helped, sure, but they weren't family. They were hired hands, good people, but not blood. Our ranch sat in southern Arizona, far from cities and civilization. Life here was slow and quiet, as if time stretched longer under the endless sky. The closest settlement was a small town where I bought feed, tools, and sold our goods. The local farmers were my only social circle. Animal attacks were rare. Over the years, there had been only a couple of incidents, mostly coyotes getting into the sheep pens, nothing like what happened last night. Then I remembered the rats. The memory gnawed at me. Why had they fled the hay barn? What could have driven them out? I'd been battling those pests for years, even brought in a few cats, but the rats always found a way back. They burrowed, nested in the barns and hayloft like it was their home. But now they were gone. No tracks, no scurrying in the corners, no shadows darting along the walls. I decided to inspect the farm. First stop, the hay barn. Standing in the doorway, I paused to take in my surroundings. It was eerily silent. Normally, I'd hear at least some rustling. The rats were always active. But now it was as if the barn had been abandoned. No tracks on the ground, no holes in the hay bales. It was like they'd never been there. That emptiness set me on edge. I made my way around the barn, checking every corner. Nothing. The usual places where rats scurried were untouched. It wasn't comforting. If anything, the silence was unnerving. The rats hadn't just left, they'd been driven out. Something had scared them off, something they sensed before we did. As I completed my rounds of the ranch, a shiver ran down my spine. A creeping unease settled over me, as though I'd overlooked something crucial, something hanging in the air like the heaviness before a storm. Work had always been my escape from troubling thoughts, and today it was exactly what I needed. The ranch demanded my attention, and I threw myself into the chores, keeping busy from dawn till dusk. It was a distraction, a way to push the strange events and unsettling tracks from the night before to the back of my mind. But peace was not in the cards. After lunch, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps, and soon Carlos came sprinting toward me. His face was pale, and his wide eyes betrayed his fear. His voice trembled as he said he'd found something strange. Work was immediately forgotten. Grabbing my hat, I followed him without hesitation. We left the boundaries of the ranch, heading toward the desert. The sun beat down relentlessly, its glare bouncing off the rocks and sand, but inside, I felt a chill creeping through me. We walked about 500 feet when I saw it, a white gleam in the distance, standing out against the dusty expanse like a shard of polished marble. Above, birds circled the sky, their calls sharp and foreboding. Their erratic, spiraling movements gave the impression they were waiting for something, or maybe warning us to stay away. As we drew closer, the sense of unease grew stronger, settling in my chest like a weight. When we reached the site, I stopped in my tracks. It was bones, white, gleaming, stripped bare. They looked polished, as if something had meticulously removed every scrap of flesh. They were fresh, too fresh. It was one of our cows. I stood there staring at the grisly sight, a wave of helplessness washing over me. This was impossible. No predator I knew of could leave bones in such a condition. My mind raced, grasping for a rational explanation, but all I found were darker, more terrifying thoughts that I tried desperately to push aside. Carlos stood next to me, wringing his hat in his hands. His lips trembled as he began to explain. He said one of the sheep had strayed from the flock, and when he went after it, he stumbled upon this place. His voice was thick with fear, and every word heightened my own unease. He muttered about strange things happening out here, and for once I couldn't argue with him. I tilted my head back to look at the birds still circling above us. Their black forms against the glaring sky looked like harbingers of doom. It felt like a sign, a warning that something unnatural threatened our ranch. I took a few pictures, but the camera couldn't capture the dread that hung in the air like a heavy fog. We decided to head back. There was still plenty of work to do. Harvest season was approaching, and the corn was nearly ready. But as we walked away, I couldn't help but notice the birds were still circling that same spot, their ominous spiral etched into my mind. Back at the ranch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something inside me snapped, a sudden urge to confirm what I already feared. I made my way to the disposal pit where we'd dumped the cow's carcass the night before. My heart pounded heavily in my chest as I approached, a sense of foreboding growing with each step. Grabbing a long pole with a hook, I began to prod the pit's contents. The pit was deep, but not so deep that anything could simply vanish. And yet the carcass was gone. Nothing remained. The stagnant water at the bottom barely rippled, leaving no trace of what had happened. I turned to Carlos, who had followed me. His face had turned ghostly white, as if he'd just seen something otherworldly. My mind fought against the conclusion, but the evidence was clear. Something, or someone, had removed the carcass. And if it was the same thing that left those tracks and killed the cow, then it had taken the body to strip it to the bone. I tried to steady myself, telling myself there was work to be done. Carlos and I returned to our chores, but the unease didn't leave me. It lingered, a relentless metronome of dread ticking louder with every passing hour. Whatever was out there, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't done with us yet. After dinner, as the evening light faded into thick darkness, I knew we wouldn't have a peaceful night. The strange events of the past 24 hours couldn't be ignored. I gathered Carlos and Hector and told them we'd keep watch tonight to figure out what was threatening our ranch. I checked the shotgun, the same one that had belonged to my father. It felt heavy in my hands, more than just its weight. We divided the territory. Carlos stayed near the barn, Hector went to the cattle pen, and I stationed myself by the hay loft, which offered a good vantage point over the property. The darkness on the ranch was oppressive, almost tangible. The sun had fully retreated beyond the horizon, leaving us alone with the shadows and our growing fears. I stood silently, my flashlight casting a narrow beam over the ground ahead of me. Beyond that, the world disappeared into black nothingness. At first it was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no chirping insects, none of the usual sounds that accompany ranch life at night. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath waiting, and then it began. At first I heard it. A scraping sound, distant but unmistakable, like claws dragging across wood or metal. It came from the southern part of the ranch, near the cattle pen. My heart started to race. The noise grew louder, turning into intermittent thuds. It could have been the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I turned on my flashlight and began moving cautiously toward the sound. My steps were slow, deliberate, but every instinct told me to hurry. Then, cutting through the silence, came another noise, a long, low howl. It sounded wolf-like, but there was something wrong with it, something unnatural. A shiver ran down my spine, and my hand shook as I held the flashlight. From the direction of the pen, Hector shouted something. His voice was strained, full of panic. I quickened my pace, my shotgun ready, my nerves frayed. When I reached the pen, Carlos and Hector were already there. Their flashlights illuminated the cattle, which were huddled in the far corner. stomping and snorting as if trying to break through the fence. In the distance beyond the pen, I saw movement. A shadow darted between the trees, too quick and too silent for me to identify clearly. The silhouette was strange, elongated, hunched. It moved like no animal I'd ever seen. Its torso was vaguely human, but its posture was bent, its arms unnaturally long, nearly brushing the ground. Its head was elongated, with a protruding snout. Hector raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking. Fear radiated off him, and I could feel it in myself too. Carlos muttered something under his breath, his lips moving rapidly as if in prayer. I couldn't take my eyes off the thing. It paused for a moment, its eyes catching the light of my flashlight, glowing faintly. Then, it let out a guttural low sound that made the cattle panic even more, their bodies pressing harder against the fence. And then it vanished. It melted into the darkness as if it had never been there. Carlos and Hector stared at me, their faces pale and filled with terror. I tried to calm them, saying it was probably just a wild animal, but I didn't believe my own words. The fear stayed with me long after the night swallowed the ranch. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside the house felt like a threat. My nerves were stretched to the breaking point, and by morning, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed advice. Someone who might understand, even if what I had to say sounded insane. I decided to visit my neighbor, Henry Coulter. He lived a few miles away on an old ranch. The road there cut through cracked, arid fields and sparse clusters of wind-worn trees. The desert heat had already settled in, pressing down even in the early hours. My thoughts churned, knowing that Henry might think I'd lost my mind. But I had to try. When I arrived, Henry was outside inspecting his pens. He was in his 60s, but the harsh life on these lands had aged him further. His skin was leathery, weathered by the sun, and his face was etched with deep lines like a map of forgotten roads. His hat was worn and a revolver hung from his belt, looking as much a part of him as his boots. I parked and stepped out, feeling sweat run down my back despite the dry heat. Henry gave me a wary look, his sharp eyes picking up on my unease immediately. I couldn't start with the whole story. It sounded too unbelievable even to me. So I hesitated, skirting around the details until the words burst out all at once. He listened in silence, his face unreadable at first. But as I spoke, I noticed a change. Beneath his tan, his skin paled slightly, and he took a small step back as if to distance himself from what I was saying. When I mentioned the tracks and the bones, his demeanor shifted again. His eyes narrowed and he grew tense, almost panicked. He asked to see the pictures. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos of the tracks and the polished white bones lying stark against the desert sand. Henry studied them carefully, but it wasn't enough for him. He frowned, muttered something under his breath, and then abruptly declared he needed to see it all for himself. We didn't waste any time. On the drive back to my ranch, Henry said little. His gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead, but his expression was grim, his lips pressed into a hard line. It was clear he knew something, though he wasn't ready to share it yet. When we arrived, he went straight to the pen. His movements were quick, almost anxious. He examined the ground, crouching to study the tracks. His fingers traced the edges of the prints, as if feeling them would confirm what his eyes already told him. We moved on to the desert. At the sight of the bones, Henry crouched again, picking one up. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. It was like the bones were speaking to him, telling him a story he understood but didn't want to acknowledge. When he stood, his face was pale, and his jaw set tightly. He dropped the bone and turned to me, his eyes filled with fear and determination. He told me to stay on the ranch, to be careful. His words were clipped, more command than suggestion. I pressed him for answers, but he shook his head. Whatever he knew, he wasn't ready to say it out loud. His behavior told me enough. He'd seen or heard of something like this before, and it terrified him. He left quickly, promising to return that evening. I watched him go, a knot tightening in my chest. Henry knew something, and whatever it was, it made the day feel darker than the night we'd just endured. When Henry left, a strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't just anxiety, it was something deeper, a gnawing sense that he knew something terrible, something I hadn't yet grasped. His pale face and trembling hands stuck in my mind, a constant reminder that this was far more serious than I wanted to admit. I tried to distract myself by getting back to work. But as I approached the barn, I was met with an unsettling sight. Carlos and Hector were packing their things. Their movements were hurried and clumsy, as though they were in a race to leave. I froze, confused. When I stepped closer, I saw Carlos, usually calm and confident, frantically shoving clothes into a battered backpack. Hector was worse off, muttering to himself under his breath, like he was trying to convince himself that leaving was the right choice. I tried to stop them, assuring them we'd figure this out together. I even offered them time off or extra pay if they stayed, but they wouldn't hear it. Carlos finally looked me in the eye and said money wasn't the issue. Something in his expression made me stop mid-sentence. They were afraid, and no amount of persuasion could overcome that fear. When they left, I stood there alone, watching them disappear down the road. The work that had once been shared among three of us now fell squarely on my shoulders. It would be tough, but I had no other option. The ranch needed tending, and there was no one else to do it. I threw myself into the chores, hoping the labor would push the fear from my mind. I fixed fences, checked the water pumps, and fed the remaining livestock. The sun beat down mercilessly, but the heat was easier to bear than the weight of my thoughts. As evening approached and the sun began to dip below the horizon, something caught my attention. A movement to the west, far off from the ranch. Birds. They were circling in the sky, dark specks against the crimson sunset. I remembered seeing the same thing before, right before we found those gleaming bones. This time, the spot was different, and my curiosity burned brighter than my fear. I grabbed my shotgun and set off toward the disturbance. The desert was less intimidating in the daylight, but every step across the cracked earth reminded me of the sounds I'd heard and the horrors I'd glimpsed. The silence around me was suffocating, not the peaceful quiet I'd grown used to, but something oppressive that made me glance over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. As I got closer, the ground beneath my feet began to change. It grew loose and crumbly, like it had been disturbed from below. Then, as I reached the spot, I saw it. A massive sinkhole gaped in the earth, its edges jagged and uneven, as if the ground had collapsed under its own weight. Peering closer, I realized it wasn't just one sinkhole. It was a network of openings, branching off in different directions like tunnels. I froze, staring into the darkness below. The rocks inside the tunnels were slick and dark, coated with something that looked like mold or lichen. The smell hit me next, damp and cloying, mixed with the sickly stench of rotting meat. Then I heard it, a deep guttural growl, low and rumbling, barely audible but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't a sound any animal I knew could make. It was something primal, predatory, and undeniably unnatural. It felt like whatever was down there wasn't just watching, it was waiting. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, adrenaline driving me faster than I thought possible. I didn't stop until I was back at the ranch, my chest heaving and my heart pounding as if it wanted to escape my ribcage. As I stood there, gasping for air, one thought circled in my mind. There's something under my ranch that shouldn't be there. I stumbled into the house, my legs trembling from exhaustion and fear. Slamming the door shut behind me, I leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was a whirlwind of images: the sinkhole, the network of tunnels, the guttural growl from the depths. It all felt so unreal that for a fleeting moment I questioned my sanity. I checked the shotgun again, loaded it, and placed it beside the door. All I could do now was wait. Around 9 o'clock, the sound of engines broke the stillness. First one, then another, then a third. The rumble grew louder until the headlights of several vehicles lit up the yard. I peeked through the window, my heart pounding. Trucks and pickups, their exhaust pipes belching smoke, were pulling up to my house. One by one, people began climbing out. Under the dim light of the porch lamp, I recognized their faces. They were my neighbors, the farmers from nearby ranches. They were armed. Their clothes were practical, dusty, and hurriedly thrown on, as if they'd scrambled to prepare. Leading them was Henry Coulter. He looked even grimmer than he had that morning. His lips were pressed into a thin line, and his eyes gleamed with steely resolve. Behind him came others. Ed Miller, a stocky man with a black beard and the constant scent of tobacco. Sam Larson, a young farmer with piercing blue eyes and grease-stained hands, and Jack Barlow, an old man in his 70s who dragged along a battered double-barrel shotgun. Each of them wore the same expression, serious, a little scared, but ready. I stepped out of the house, and Henry gave me a curt nod before saying we needed to talk inside. Without hesitation, the men followed him in. We gathered in the living room. The men settled wherever they could, on the couch, on old chairs, or leaning against the walls. Henry sat directly across from me, his posture stiff, one leg crossed over the other. The room was thick with tension, the kind that weighs on your chest and makes every sound feel louder than it is. It was Ed Miller who broke the silence. He said Henry had told them what was happening, and that this wasn't just a coincidence. His words made the room shift with murmurs, but Henry raised a hand, quieting everyone. Then he began to speak. Henry told us a story, a legend he'd known since he was a child. It dated back over 100 years, to the days when the first settlers came to these lands. Among them were fortune seekers, gold miners who hoped to strike it rich in the desert. And one day they did. They discovered a cave filled with gold. They dug deeper, expanding the tunnels, delving further into the earth. But eventually, they uncovered something they never should have disturbed. Henry called it an ancient evil, something that had been sleeping and was now awake. He described creatures no one could fully explain. Part human, part beast, strong, fast, and merciless. They emerged from the depths, killing livestock, destroying villages, and disappearing into the night. Many of the settlers were killed. Every few decades, these creatures would reawaken, and the descendants of the original settlers were left to deal with them. Henry turned to me and said I was part of that history. My ancestors, he explained, had been among the first settlers who dug up that cave. He admitted no one truly knew what the creatures were. Some thought they were a curse. Others believed they were the result of ancient experiments. But one thing was certain. When they emerged, they had to be stopped. If left unchecked, they would bring death and destruction. When Henry finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. I looked around at the faces of my neighbors. Fear and determination flickered across their features. They all understood that they were now part of this, whether they wanted to be or not. I couldn't believe what I'd heard from Henry and the others. Legends, ancient, evil creatures breaking out from beneath the earth. It all sounded too far-fetched. But I had seen the tracks, the bones in that cave with its dark, twisting tunnels. It was real. The question was I ready to fight? Doubt clawed at me from the inside. I looked around at my neighbors. Their faces were grim, serious with determination burning in their eyes. These people weren't here for money or glory. They were here to protect their families, their land, their homes. And I realized I had to do the same. I had to protect my ranch, my ancestors' land, and ensure it stayed ours. Henry said we were waiting for John Harder, the owner of the local gun shop. He was bringing everything we'd need to defend ourselves. We sat on the porch, tense but silent, each lost in thought, until the sound of an approaching pickup truck shattered the stillness. Headlights cut through the darkness, revealing an old truck with a tall bed covered by a tarp. John stepped out of the cab, a tall, wiry man in his 40s, with short stubble and his signature cigar clenched between his teeth. His jeans and jacket were faded but sturdy, much like the man himself. He looked like someone who'd seen his share of trouble and wasn't afraid of the unknown. John walked to the truck bed and yanked the tarp away, revealing neatly packed boxes. Henry, the others, and I jumped in to unload. The boxes were heavy, but no one complained. We carried them into the house and began opening them. Inside were weapons. Shotguns, rifles, a few handguns. There were also night vision goggles, portable floodlights, hunting traps, and even a few crates of explosives. Seeing all of this, my doubts faded into the background. We were armed and ready. I told the others about the sinkhole I'd found in the desert, the tunnels stretching downward, and the eerie sounds echoing from below. Henry quickly decided we needed to rig the cave entrances with explosives and set up an ambush. It was our only chance to stop these things if they surfaced. We grabbed the weapons and explosives. Henry assigned tasks. John would go down into the cave to plant the charges, while the rest of us took up defensive positions around the area. Night had already fallen, draping the ranch in a black shroud. But we couldn't wait for morning. As we passed the livestock pens, I noticed something strange. The cattle were behaving oddly. They stood in a tight circle, perfectly formed, and not one of them moved. Their heads hung low, their eyes glinting in the beam of our flashlights. It was wrong. Animals don't act like that. We stopped, exchanging uneasy glances. I saw fear in every face. Even Henry, normally unshakable, looked rattled. Something unseen had driven those cows into that circle, and that was the most terrifying part. Finally, we reached the sinkhole. Its dark maw yawned open, and the wind howled from within like a warning of things to come. John secured a rope to a nearby tree, grabbed a flashlight and a box of explosives, and began his descent. We watched as the beam of his flashlight slowly disappeared into the darkness. When he was nearly at the bottom, a strange sound echoed up from the hole. A growl, deep and guttural like it came from the earth's core. John froze for a moment before continuing. His voice, muffled by the cave's echo, called up to say he was planting the charges. We stood above, armed and tense. Every noise around us felt ominous. The wind rustled the bushes, and shadows danced in the flashlight beams. Finally, John climbed back up, sweaty but triumphant. The charges were set. We took up positions around the sinkhole, forming a makeshift ambush. The flashlights were set so that narrow beams of light pointed into the abyss, leaving the surrounding area shrouded in darkness. Rifles and shotguns were loaded and ready, placed within arm's reach alongside ammunition and a radio to keep communication open among the group. Night vision goggles lay nearby, switched on, but we only used them sparingly to scan the dark terrain and conserve battery. Every one of us was strung tight, as though an internal spring wound by fear was ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The air was still and oppressively warm, as if nature itself was too afraid to stir. Time passed agonizingly slowly. Near the cave, the only sounds were our uneven breaths and the occasional dull thud of a heartbeat in our ears. We crouched on the dry, cracked earth, hiding behind rocks and sparse bushes. The scent of dust and old decay rose from the ground, but nothing else distracted us. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, my thoughts drifted back to what had brought us here. I remembered the feeling of looking into the sinkhole and hearing that growl. The memory sent a chill down my spine, and I clenched my fists involuntarily. Deep down, I knew we weren't fighting some ordinary animal, but something that defied the natural order. No one made a sound. There were no commands, no conversations. We understood each other without words. Each of us was bracing for the worst. The wind didn't stir, and the silence was so thick it felt like a physical weight. The empty, echoing void surrounded us, and none of us knew if it would be broken by a faint rustle or a sudden, horrifying roar. Time seemed frozen. Sometimes it felt like hours had passed, and I would start to notice the stiffness in my body from sitting still for so long. But when I checked my watch, only a few minutes had gone by. The tension was suffocating. Our thoughts gnawed at us. But leaving was not an option. We all knew that if we didn't deal with this thing or things, now it would only get worse. The first movement came suddenly. I caught it in my peripheral vision, right where the beam of the flashlight grazed the edge of the sinkhole. Something faint and shadowy shifted with strange, unnatural contours. I strained my eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, melting back into the void. Still, something inside me tightened. I knew our visitors wouldn't keep us waiting much longer. My grip on the shotgun tightened. The first wave of horrific sounds came from deep within the cave. It wasn't just a growl or a howl. It was a reverberating roar, woven from several sounds at once. It resembled the growl of a large animal, but there were undertones that didn't belong to any creature I could name. It was as if a chorus of throats had merged, each emitting a sound too low, too vibrating, or too alien to be natural. The sound made my blood run cold. Goosebumps crawled over my skin. A few of the others tensed even further, their fingers trembling as they gripped their weapons, knuckles white. It felt like our hearts would burst through our chests at any moment, but none of us moved or made a sound. Then came the scratching. A jagged, intermittent scraping, like claws dragging against stone, grew louder and closer. It was as if something, or several somethings, was clawing its way up the vertical walls of the sinkhole. Deeper in the tunnel, there were loud cracks, perhaps rocks breaking loose or something forcefully dislodging them. The eerie symphony from the cave's depths turned wading into sheer torture. The flashlights illuminated only part of the sinkhole. The cave was deeper than we had anticipated, and its tunnels twisted away into the darkness, leaving much of it untouched by the beams of light. I could make out the damp, textured walls covered in strange, uneven growths. But beyond that, everything dissolved into pitch-black void. Suddenly, something crawled out of the abyss, a shadow that seemed to ripple and distort as it moved. It briefly entered the flashlight beam, and I got a glimpse. Its body contorted at unnatural angles, with elongated forelimbs ending in curved claws that glinted faintly in the light. Its hunched back was covered in coarse bristles or jagged patches of fur. Its grotesque face jutted forward like an animal's, but the jaws opened far too wide to be natural. Its eyes glowed a feral red, wild and crazed. The creature crouched low to the ground as if avoiding the light, but still crept forward. We fired first. Gunshots rang out, the flash of muzzle fire lighting up the area. For a split second, I saw the creature's form more clearly. The bullets tore through the air, and some ricocheted off the stone, sending shards and dust flying. Yet it felt like the thing wasn't quite where we were aiming, as if it moved faster than we could track. The shooting lasted only seconds before an eerie silence fell again, broken only by the ringing in our ears. Someone nearby exhaled sharply. Another reloaded a shotgun. I cautiously leaned out from behind my cover. Flashlight pointed toward where the creature had been. The beam revealed a shadowed shape, with dark stains spreading across the rocks and faint drops of a thick, dark liquid. At least a few of our shots had hit their mark. But then came the howl. Long, piercing, and bone-chilling, it echoed from deep within the cave. More voices joined it, a chorus of monsters crying out in pain and rage. It sounded as if the earth itself had come alive, teeming with enraged creatures seeking vengeance. The scratching and scraping intensified. The sound of countless claws on stone filled the air, growing louder and closer. The ground beneath us seemed to vibrate as though an immense living mass was moving below. For a moment we froze in terror, but then the realization hit. This wasn't just one creature. There were more of them. Someone switched on the floodlights, illuminating as much of the sinkhole's depths as possible. Bright white beams cut through the darkness, revealing the cave walls. A grim texture of black and gray streaked with water stains and patches of mold. The light flickered and danced, occasionally blinding us. But soon it became clear. Shadows moved below. Several shapes darted swiftly, seamlessly flowing from one patch of darkness to another. We couldn't afford to lose another second. If even one of these creatures made it to the surface, our fight would become immeasurably harder. We opened fire in long, deliberate bursts, aiming to cover the areas where movement came from. Shotgun pellets and bullets struck the rocks, sparks flying as some ricocheted into the distance. The cave's natural acoustics amplified the cacophony, creating a deafening symphony of gunfire and echoes. Gunpowder smoke filled the air, stinging my eyes and clogging my throat. But fear kept me focused. We all knew that easing our assault, even for a moment, would give the creatures the opening they needed. Despite our efforts, one of the shadows broke through, emerging unexpectedly from a side tunnel. It burst onto the surface out of the floodlight's direct glare, catching us off guard. I barely caught the movement out of the corner of my eye as the creature leapt in a massive bound, vanishing into the darkness. The ground shuddered when its heavy body landed near one of the scattered trees. At first it disappeared behind the trunk, but then it peeked out, baring its teeth in a snarl so guttural and loud that it chilled me to the bone. I swung my flashlight toward the source of the noise, quickly grabbing my rifle fitted with a scope. My fingers trembled, but I forced myself to focus and steady my breathing. The creature darted to the right, moving unnaturally fast, but for a split second, its silhouette lined up in my crosshairs. I fired. The bullet struck its side, causing it to jolt and emit a wet, guttural roar before collapsing onto its haunches. From its wound, thick, almost black liquid began to drip. But it wasn't enough. The creature seemed barely fazed by the injury. It straightened up and let out another low, resonant howl before charging directly toward my position. My heart raced as I scrambled to reload. every movement feeling excruciatingly slow. Seeing the monster closing the distance, I dove to the side. Gunfire erupted around me as my neighbors opened up with shotguns and revolvers. The hail of bullets was relentless, overwhelming the beast's agility. It collapsed to the ground, its massive body shaking the earth with its weight. The night seemed to explode with stars as the muzzle flashes reflected in the air around us. We collectively exhaled, watching as the creature writhed in its death throes. Even in its final moments, it was horrifying. Its limbs spasmed, claws curling unnaturally. Its coarse, bristled hide oozed dark blood. The flashlight beam highlighted its grotesque maw. Yellowed fangs set in a jawline that seemed a grotesque blend of human and animal. Whatever this thing was, it couldn't have been a natural creation. But there was no time to celebrate. The ominous rumble from the tunnels below continued to grow. We knew that if one creature had found a side exit, others could do the same. Or worse, they could burst through the main shaft all at once. We regrouped near the sinkhole, taking up a new defensive position. Someone adjusted the floodlights, trying to cover the side cracks and fissures now visible in the ground. Suddenly, an enraged howl echoed from the tunnels, and another figure emerged. Smaller than the last, but faster, it slid down the cave wall with inhuman grace. We struggled to aim in time. The creature darted toward a large rock and scaled it effortlessly, leaping to the top in a single bound. Its hunched form loomed briefly in the flashlight's glare, claws gripping the stone's edges. Without hesitation, we fired. The synchronized shots riddled the beast with bullets, sending it tumbling off the rock and disappearing behind a boulder. But the assault wasn't over. From the depths of the cave, 3 more dark silhouettes emerged, sprinting across the surface with terrifying speed. I could see them spreading out, trying to flank us. Their movements were fluid and deliberate, more like intelligent predators than mindless animals. Shadows flickered among the bushes as the creatures closed in. We unleashed a barrage of bullets, spraying the areas where they moved, but one managed to sneak closer, crawling low to the ground. The creature leapt at Sam, one of the men sitting a few feet to my left. He fell onto his back as the monster pinned him, its long, sinewy limbs wrapping around his shoulders. Its jaws snapped inches from his face as it attempted to bite down. Without thinking, I rushed toward the struggle. My rifle's safety was on, and I couldn't risk hitting Sam. In a split-second decision, I swung the rifle's stock into the creature's side. The blow wasn't strong, but it was enough to distract it. The beast loosened its grip, giving Sam the chance to roll away. We acted quickly. 3 of us fired point blank with shotguns, the blasts tearing through the creature's body. It shuddered violently before going limp, its blood mixing with the smoke-filled air, creating a nauseating stench. Chaos erupted around us. Screeches, roars, and the crack of gunfire filled the night. The sinkhole seemed alive, and a horrifying realization dawned on me. There could be entire colonies of these creatures deeper in the earth, stirred awake by our presence. We couldn't wait any longer. Henry's plan had been clear from the start. If the creatures breached the surface, we'd blow the cave. And it looked like the time had come. We gave the signal, and one of our groups sprinted toward the spot where the detonators and wires were set up. Carefully, he ran the wire to the edge of the sinkhole. Several charges had already been planted deep within the cave earlier. All that remained was to activate them, but the timing had to be perfect to collapse the main tunnels and prevent the creatures from escaping. The monsters, however, weren't retreating without a fight. Soon, a deafening roar drowned out the gunfire and the ringing in our ears. From the main entrance, ignoring the glare of the floodlights, New silhouettes began crawling out one after another. We couldn't keep up with aiming. We had to fire almost blindly. Some of the creatures we managed to shoot, but even wounded, they kept crawling forward, leaving black stains in their wake, collapsing only after suffering fatal damage. A few of the creatures tilted their heads back and let out long, blood-curdling howls, as though summoning others. The cries echoed from deep within the abyss, and an icy thought gripped me. There could be far more of them down there than we imagined. Someone hurled a grenade, and the explosion temporarily blinded us with its brilliant white flash. Shrapnel and dust filled the air, and from the chaos emerged grotesque, mutilated bodies. Some had lost limbs but still dragged themselves forward, emitting gurgling sounds. Fear clutched at our throats, but there was no room for panic. Only decisive, rapid action could save us now. I saw a few of us exchange quick glances and begin dragging heavy crates closer to the sinkhole. These held additional ammunition and a second set of explosives. We hadn't wanted to use everything at once, but the situation left us no choice. Venturing deeper into the shafts wasn't an option. It would have been certain death. Torn apart in those narrow tunnels. The only way was to trigger a series of blasts from above to seal off the main passages. Our floodlights began to dim as their batteries drained. One of them flickered, casting brief flashes of light. Between those flashes, we were plunged into near-total darkness, hearing only the roars and clawing sounds growing ever closer. Each time the light flared back to life, it revealed snarling faces creeping toward us, crawling over the ground or bounding across boulders. We kept firing, but the ammo was disappearing fast. Spent shells clattered to the ground, hot casings burning our hands as they fell. Some of us were already injured, deep scratches from claws or shredded clothing exposing bloody gashes. The heat of the fight and the rush of adrenaline dulled the pain, leaving only fear and fury to drive us forward. There was no turning back. Retreat was impossible. One creature, riddled with wounds and bleeding heavily, managed to reach the crates of equipment. It tore into our makeshift supply zone, scattering boxes of ammunition. The stench emanating from it was unbearable, a mix of decay and something far worse. Its blood-red eyes glinted with feral rage. Without hesitation, we all lunged at it. Losing the equipment meant losing the fight. We attacked simultaneously. Gunshots rang out and the creature's body jerked with each hit. Someone struck it with a rifle stock and it collapsed, crushing part of the equipment beneath its massive weight. The sound of cracking and scraping grew louder. More creatures were emerging from the depths. We realized our strength wouldn't last if they kept coming. The thought was suffocating. If they break through now, none of us will make it out alive. It was time to go all in. We had to detonate the charges. But first, we needed to drive the monsters back long enough to activate the explosives and retreat to safety. A silent agreement passed between us. This was the only way. Grenades were thrown, creating a wall of fire and explosions. Amid the chaos, one of us sprinted to the detonator. He grabbed the lever, checked the wires, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, we all held our breath. The explosion was cataclysmic. At first, there was a deep, muffled boom beneath the earth, followed by a thunderous roar like the strike of 1,000 hammers. The ground beneath us shook violently as the detonation erupted, sending fountains of stone and dust skyward. The shockwave knocked several of us to our knees, and we shielded our heads as debris rained down. Through the haze, we saw chunks of the cave walls collapsing, blocking the tunnels. The sound was deafening, leaving nothing but an eerie ringing in my ears. When I opened my eyes again, the night sky was obscured by a murky gray cloud of dust. The floodlights struggled to cut through the dense fog of debris and sand. For a moment, I couldn't tell if we'd all survived, or if the tunnels had been sealed. Slowly, I noticed my comrades rising to their feet, panting, weapons still in hand, scanning the area for any remaining threats. Silence fell, broken only by the faint groaning of settling rock. Then, from the far side of the cave, a weak howl echoed, a pitiful sound compared to the earlier roars. It seemed that some creatures might still be alive, but their escape routes were buried beneath tons of rubble. The dust began to settle, revealing a massive pile of rocks and boulders where the main tunnels had been. The sinkhole was now a fortress of debris, with narrow cracks that no large creature could hope to squeeze through. The air was thick with the acrid smell of sulfur, decay, and gunpowder. My eyes stung, and my throat burned as I struggled to breathe. Slowly, we edged closer to the rim of the sinkhole, staying low to avoid drawing attention from any survivors below. The scene was one of devastation. The cave had collapsed into a heap of jagged rubble, sealing off the depths where those horrors had stirred. For the first time that night, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. We might just have survived. Several creatures remained on the surface, crushed beneath the rubble or killed by gunfire. Some were partially buried, their twisted limbs and grotesque faces frozen in agonized death. We stood there in shock, struggling to comprehend that it was over. The most important thing, though, was the silence from below. The once ominous rumble had ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness that was both a relief and a source of unease, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Victory had come at a high price. Several of our group were badly injured. One man lay clutching his side, his hands soaked in blood, unable to stand. Another had a broken leg and gritted his teeth to keep from crying out. Spent shell casings, shattered equipment, and pools of dark, viscous liquid from the creatures littered the battlefield. The air reeked of gunpowder and decay. As the initial shock wore off, we began to take stock of the situation. My adrenaline was still surging, but fear had been replaced by grim determination. We needed to confirm there were no more threats, recover what ammunition and supplies we could, and tend to the wounded. Slowly, we swept the area, shining flashlights into every crevice and shadow. The creatures showed no signs of life, and the collapsed tunnels remained silent. The dust from the explosion began to settle, revealing a grim, desolate scene. Where chaos had reigned just moments ago, there was now an oppressive stillness. Broken bodies, shattered rocks, and the remains of monstrous beings were scattered everywhere, creating a grotesque tableau of the night's horror. I glanced at the others who were still standing. Their faces mirrored my own, exhaustion, bewilderment, and the quiet terror of what we had just endured. We knew we couldn't let our guard down. The injured needed to be moved to safety, and we had to ensure there were no alternate routes for the creatures to escape. Henry, surprisingly unscathed and composed, signaled for us to form a perimeter. While we stayed close together, we began to comb the nearby desert, shining our flashlights across the barren landscape. The aftermath of the battle was everywhere. Dark bloodstains, claw marks gouged into the ground, trampled earth. Here and there, fragments of the creatures' bodies lay scattered. Claws, tufts of bristled fur, splintered bones. It was a gruesome reminder of what we had faced. Realizing we couldn't leave anything to chance, we retrieved the reserve explosives and set charges near a secondary fissure at the edge of the rubble. Once they were placed, we moved the injured further back and prepared for another detonation. When the second explosion came, it wasn't as thunderous as the first. but it sent fresh tremors through the ground. We held our positions, scanning every inch of the terrain, weapons ready. Minutes passed and no new creatures emerged. The silence returned, deeper and more final. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The landscape was scarred, craters, smoke, jagged rocks, and the mangled remains of creatures that defied nature. I knew even then that life would never go back to what it was before. A part of me had been irrevocably changed by this encounter with something I would have preferred to remain ignorant of. We gathered what supplies and medical kits we could salvage and began tending to the wounded. Our hands shook from exhaustion and shock as we bandaged cuts and stabilized fractures. No one complained. We spent the night huddled together by a small fire, far from the sinkhole. Sleep was impossible. We sat clutching our weapons, eyes scanning the darkness, ears straining for the slightest sound. At dawn, the sun rose over the desert, painting it in pale orange hues. The daylight revealed the stark reality of what had happened. The sinkhole was now a massive heap of collapsed boulders, with jagged rock spires piercing through the debris. Dead creatures lay scattered, their rotting stench already attracting circling vultures. Their shadows glided over the ground like specters, adding to the oppressive weight of the morning. We decided to spend the day ensuring the sinkhole would never reopen. Using what equipment we had, old tractors and loaders, we began to pile dirt, rocks, and debris over the rubble. Every shovel of earth felt like sealing a tomb. As I watched the heavy machinery push massive loads into place, it felt like we were constructing a grave, a monument to the horrors of the night. The work was grueling, but necessary. The gaping wound in the earth had to be sealed completely, burying any remaining creatures and ensuring they could never escape. As I stood there, watching the final stones fall into place, a chilling thought struck me. Even if we succeeded in burying them here, what if there were more like them elsewhere? For now, though, the fight was over. All we could do was hope that this grave would hold, and the monsters that haunted us would remain buried forever. When the work was finally complete and it became clear that the cave was securely sealed, I realized the long road to recovery that lay ahead. The ranch had suffered not only physical damage, we'd lost livestock, workers had fled or perished, and the emotional toll was immeasurable. Yet I knew life had to go on. This land was my connection to my family, to my past. And now, after facing an ancient evil that had only existed in legends, I understood it was my duty to hold on to this land and ensure it never again became a haven for monsters. For the next week, we focused on cleaning up the area. The bodies of the creatures were buried in deep pits, covered with layers of lime. No one wanted to risk disease or any other consequences of their contamination. The atmosphere remained tense, even though there were no further signs of the monsters. The rats, once our ever-present barnyard neighbors, never returned. It felt as if all animal life had abandoned the area, sensing the lingering echoes of the horror we had endured. The injured were slowly recovering, though some required hospitalization. I found myself haunted by recurring dreams, wandering through the desert surrounded by bones, of cattle and of those monstrous creatures. Vultures circled above. The air reeked of decay, and from somewhere distant came a low, guttural growl as though something waited for me in the shadows. I woke in cold sweats, my heart pounding with the same dread I'd felt during those awful nights. Despite the nightmares, I forced myself to return to the daily routines of ranch life, inspecting fences, repairing irrigation systems, and maintaining equipment. My neighbors, too, pushed forward, helping each other as we tried to rebuild. Sometimes it felt as if the whole ordeal had been a nightmare. But the memory of my trembling hands holding a rifle staring at those grotesque bodies reminded me it was all too real. A month passed, and I noticed the slow return of life. Birds began flying over the ranch again, and in the evenings, the familiar sounds of insects and rustling winds filled the air. Nature, in its quiet, persistent way, was reclaiming its place. But within us, the deep scars remained, a constant, unspoken reminder of what we had survived. I still startled at unexpected noises, especially at night. I scrutinized every strange track in the dirt. More than once, I caught myself sitting by the window, shotgun across my lap, waiting for a threat that never came. But with each passing month, life gradually settled into a rhythm. The crackle of the radio, the distant hum of passing trucks, and conversations with neighbors anchored us in reality. Some of the ranch hands returned to their duties, but others left for good, unable to cope with the memories. I didn't blame them. I had seen the fear in their eyes. As for me, leaving was never an option. This land was my home, my roots, my legacy. Eventually, we decided to revisit the site where we had detonated the cave. What was once a gaping abyss was now a massive mound of rocks and compacted soil. Nothing remained of the yawning pit except for the occasional puffs of dust stirred by the wind. Yet I couldn't shake the thought that deep below, buried beneath tons of rubble, the tunnels might still exist. And perhaps, within those dark depths, something still stirred. But whatever lay down there, it was trapped, and it wasn't getting out.